science and religion. Of course, since the new atheists have come along, there is a pretty strong movement afoot that sort of implies that if you accept Darwinism, you have to be an atheist. And so there's this kind of culture war, new culture wars going on that about whether that's true or not. I don't happen to think it's true, but we'll come to that in a minute. But a lot of people think it is, and therefore, if you ask somebody, you have to choose between Darwin and your religion. Most people that's a no-brainer for most people, especially Americans. They're not going to choose Darwin. Why would they? So if you make them give something up that's so important to their lives, it has nothing to do with science. We have to remember that there's two aspects of religion. There's the explanatory mode where it's attempting to explain nature. Science beat that part of religion out centuries ago. That's gone. But there's a whole other aspect of religion, obviously it hasn't died out, that fills some kind of human purpose. And that has to do with the social aspects, the music, the food, the camaraderie, the group cohesiveness, the friendship, the social capital, as sociologists call it, that's sort of how we all hang together. And religion does a lot of that science just simply doesn't do. I mean, just look at Katrina and New Orleans and compare who did the most, the secular government or the private religion. Well, compare FEMA to the religions that did it, and that pretty much makes the case. I mean, science doesn't do that, governments don't do it very well, religions do it much better. So if you're saying, okay, you have to choose between the theory of evolution and church is going to help the poor, well, what kind of a choice is that? See, that's part of why I think it's the whole false alternative. Most of religion has nothing to do with science, so asking to choose between them is a little ridiculous. Yes, explaining things, that's what science does best. But that is one of the things that people feel like you're making them choose. A couple other things. I think the thing that bothers people about religion is it's a little degrading if you don't interpret it in a positive light. That is, you mean we're one of those guys? One of those chimp ape types? Like you see the bonobos? I mean, they have sex all the time. Yeah, that's a bad thing. And this guy I met, I have to tell you this funny story. I have a picture of this guy that'll be in my next week's Sea Skeptic thing. But anyway, his name was Anthony Bush, and he ran this Noah's Ark Zoo. So he had this big poster of the differences between apes and humans. Rather than the gazillion similarities that are remarkable, he wanted to point out the 18 differences. A bunch of which had to do with sex. He seemed very interested in talking about sex for some reason. And he did this whole thing about, how the vagina is structured in such a way that the penis fits just right so humans can have orgasms and no other species has orgasms. Really? He goes, that's the only way to have orgasms. I said, oh, no, it's not actually. But listen, if that's... that was pretty funny. He thinks that's the missionary position is the only... Oh, sorry, I left that part out. Yeah, I said, speak for yourself, sir. Anyway, and so I showed him a picture that Franz de Waal sent me of bonobos in the missionary position. And said, whoa, okay. But there is that sense that, like, we're not one of those guys, are we? I mean, they're animals. Well, yeah. But instead of trying to look at the differences, why don't we look at the similarities? Why don't we look at what we're able to do with our brain or whatever? But it's just the spin you put on it. I think there's also the sense of ethical nihilism, that if this is all true, then what's the basis of morality? If there's no Archimedean point outside of our own world here to tell us what's right and wrong, then you mean anything goes. So you end up with this, again, this choice that is a false alternative. You mean the choice between ethical nihilism and anything goes, and Hitler got away with it, and that's just fine, versus good Christian upstanding, right and wrong, and we know what it is. But that's sort of the choice people feel like they have to make, and that's the wrong choice. Actually, I think Darwinism gives us a moral purpose and so on. And then finally, I should note, because I'm not completely liberal, I'm also partially conservative, is I think there's this idea that evolution only operates below the neck. For most people who accept evolution, they still have a hard time accepting that our brains evolved. Not just our brains, our minds evolved. Our characteristics evolve, our personality evolves, our intelligence evolves. The reason for that is since World War II, it's been largely unacceptable to look at those things that might show group differences and therefore allow for discrimination. Okay, I understand that. I understand why we should be super careful about that and not allow it to be, a scientific theory to be abused. This is why Ben Stein was on about the whole expelled thing, from Darwin to Hitler and all that. There is actually a train of thought that, but everybody used Darwin to their abused Darwin. The capitalists did that, the communists did it, the socialists did it, the fascists did it, everybody did it. The misuse of the theory says nothing about its validity. Okay, I'm going to just mention the three best arguments that the intelligent design creationists put forward. Although I should point out that all of them are in the category of the God of the gaps argument. And it goes like this. I can't think of how X came about naturally, therefore X came about supernaturally. That's it. Just fill in the blank. X is whatever it is. In Paley's time, it was like the wing or the eye, fingers, the various sort of gross anatomy of the human body. In Darwin's time, it was the wing. A guy named St. George Mivart wrote a book basically presenting the problem called the problem of incipient stages. How do you get from no wing to 100% of a wing? I'll grant you it's an adaptive structure once it's fully up and running, and it makes an organism aerodynamic and can fly, escape predators, capture prey, cover a lot of ground in no time. But what good is 50% of a wing? You can't fly with 50% of a wing, so how would a ratcheting, stepwise Darwinian system get you there? So Darwin already answered this, and so I don't know why these creationists keep making the same, well, I do know why, because they're, anyway, because they have another agenda. And the answer is, it wasn't a poorly developed wing when it was 50%, it was a well-developed something else. In the case of the wing, it appears to be a thermoregulating device, and possibly a device for moving along the ground or climbing up hills or trees just by grasping, pulling, clawing. And in the case of penguins, it's a terrific structure for moving through the water as a rudder. Wings can serve all sorts of purposes. So Darwin's answer, and it's still the answer today, is that it was used for something else and then was accepted. What Steve Gould calls it acceptation. Adaptation, acceptation. It was originally evolved for one purpose, then it gets co-opted or accepted later from some other new purpose. Okay. So that's a fairly simple one, but that's the kind of thing like, if you hook your faith to the gap, if you guys can't explain where that came from, boy, that's it. I'm in there, my guy wins. Well, no, then what are you going to do when the gap is filled? And that's what happens. I think somebody mentioned earlier, Newton in the Principia at the end, he wrote about the problem of the plane, while all the planets are in the plane of the ecliptic, and they all go around the same, well, in his time, they're all going the same direction, spinning the same way. And how is it that gravity could explain this? He couldn't think of how to figure that out, so he attributed to the deity this most grand, beautiful system laid out by the great intelligence, so forth. And nobody quotes that today. I'm always amazed that intelligent design creationists don't quote that. The great Isaac Newton, the greatest scientist of all time, in one of the most important books ever written, says, intelligent designer did it. And the reason is because we now have a good theory of how planets are formed, stars and planets are formed out of condensing clouds of interstellar gas and so forth, and as it collapses, it begins to flatten into a disk and spin and so forth. And so the gap's filled. That's the end of that. Now let's move on to the next thing. And that's the problem with all of these intelligent design arguments. They're just looking for the gap, and it ends there. That's the end of the argument. They want to just stop there. Whereas if you're a graduate student and you want to get your PhD, you have to start at the gap and then try to fill it, or at least enough to convince your professor to sign off on the on the dissertation and pass the test, and off you go and create your own lab. I mean, we're in the business of filling gaps. Creationists are in the business of just finding them and stopping right there. And that's the ultimate problem with all these arguments. Nevertheless, the three best arguments, here they are. The anthropic principle, the universe looks like it's fine-tuned for life. So, for example, they quote Sir Martin Rees's book, Just Six Numbers, like omega is the amount of matter in the universe. If omega was greater than 1, would have collapsed long ago. Too much matter collapses back. If it's significantly less than 1, then matter would have been too diffuse, and the galaxies and stars wouldn't have formed. Boom. Epsilon, 0.007, how firmly atomic nuclei bind together such that if it was 0.006 or 0.008, matter could not exist. It's not saying that matter would exist in some other form. It couldn't exist at all. There wouldn't even be atoms.